Okay, so for science, you have two different sheets. They look like this. This one is your note sheet. It says Chapter 1, Lesson 1, pages 7 to 9. While you are watching this video, you can go ahead and you'd be filling this out. This needs to be done. If you need to pause the video or rewind the video, you can do that. Once you're done watching the video, you would complete this worksheet. Anytime you have any questions, you can always go back in your book. You will always find the answers to these questions. Even looking in your notes, you might get some of the answer to your questions on there. Just remember that on number 9, it's always going to tell you to use complete sentences so that you are ready to get both points on there. This should be something that if you are following along with your notes in the video, then this worksheet should be pretty easy for you. So before we get going through the video, pause, get these two sheets out, open your books to page 7 to 9 if you'd like to follow along. Once you've got that done, hit play. Alright, remember that you should have out your Chapter 1, Lesson 1 notes, and you should have your books open to pages 7 to 9. We're going to be looking at today, why do we classify? I'm going to begin reading at the top of page 7 where it says from 1804 to 1806. From 1804 to 1806, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and their team described hundreds of plants and animals, so these could be classified. To classify organisms, the skills of observation and comparison are used. Working into the first section, Lewis and Clark's mission of discovery. Lewis and Clark led their team to find a route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and to investigate the organisms that lived in the West. The team described hundreds of animals and plants. They also collected many samples of plants and animals. Later, biologists used the samples and descriptions to classify the organisms. To classify means to put things into groups. To classify an organism, these biologists use the skills of observation and comparison that most scientists use in their work. First, they observed each organism carefully, then they compared and contrasted their observations with known plants and animals. They tried to place similar organisms in one group. A plant or animal that was very different from others would be put into a new group. So we see right away that two things they did. They investigated and collected samples, and after they did that, they'd observe and then compare and contrast those samples. The biggest thing they did was classify, and if I'm going back to my notes, I see that classify means to put things into groups. When it's highlighted in your text, that's always going to be an important word that you need to know. So make sure that you're filling your notes out as we go through. I see next at my notes that it says reasons to classify. So as I'm reading this next section, listen for 2 reasons why we should classify. A classification system makes it easier for all scientists to communicate clearly. They list each organism by just one name. Without a classification system, scientists might call one organism by different names, or they might use one name for more than one organism. That would be confusing. A system can also help to organize information about organisms. By just knowing what category an organism is in, much can be known about it. For an example, an organism classified as a plant most likely needs light to live. So the first reason to classify is that it's easier to communicate. We know communication is really important. If I were to call you one name and then your mom called you another name and then Mrs. Bauer called you another name and Mr. Harvey called you another name, it'd be really tricky to know who we were talking about, and you could even be confused. Another reason to classify is because it helps organize information. It's in different categories, and it tells us more about the organism. So if they're in one category, it can tell us more about it. If it has 4 legs, it might be in a category with other 4-legged animals. If it's got 2 legs, it's going to be in a two-legged animal category. So it just tells us more about the organism. When we flip over to pages 8 to 9, you're going to see that there's a lot of pictures on that. I want to read through the classification systems first, and then we will go ahead and you can read about those different categories. A classification system lists organisms in a series of groups. Today's classification system has been developed by many people over years. In fact, it is still changing. At one time, people believed that all living things were either plants or animals. So scientists divided all living things into two kingdoms, the plant kingdom and animal kingdom. A kingdom was the highest or most general group of organisms. Today, a popular system uses 6 kingdoms shown below, and you can see that on the bottom of page 8, the different kingdoms. Within each kingdom, scientists compared and contrasted the structures of the organisms and put similar organisms into groups. Each group was called a phylum. Plural is you'd call it phyla. A phylum was the next level of classification below kingdom. Scientists then separated each phylum into smaller groups called classes. A class was the level of classification below phylum. Scientists kept dividing each level into smaller and smaller levels, order, family, and genus, continuing to the lowest level called the species. And you can see this on your note sheet, the different where it goes down from kingdom all the way down to species. So kingdom is going to be the most general, whereas species is the most specific group of organisms. So this just describes that kingdom is the most general, whereas species is the most specific. And you can even hear species specific, and that's going to kind of help you fill out your notes also. The other thing to note that's really important is that these classification systems are always changing. It's not like it's just set in stone where an animal is in one group and then can't change or fit into other groups. Scientists are not set in stone. They're not always agreeing, so that system is going to be always changing. You guys can read through the 6 kingdoms of living things on your own. I'm also going to let you read through the graph on page 9 where it talks about the gray wolf being classified into different groups. It's just that it gets more specific each time, where in the top row, if it's just talking about animals, the wolf fits in there, but so do a bunch of other animals. And then when it goes into the next group, the phylum, that's where it goes into talking about the wolf, and then that worm got cut out. It no longer fits in there. And then as it goes further and further down, only the wolf by the end is the species that it fits into, just because the other animals don't fit that description. As you work through your worksheet today, make sure that you are looking back either at your notes or into your book on pages 7 to 9 to help you complete your sheet.